Filing these serial numbers off is a phrase that is used to describe the process of removing all recognizable IP from a fanfiction so that it can be traditionally published. So for example, if you had written an AU about Kylo Ren and Rey, you would definitely want to change the names of the main characters before you published it so that you don't get sued by Disney, which is now a common enough practice that we have a phrase for it. I've also heard pulled to publish in a lot of the research I've been doing. I had never heard that before putting together this video, so I don't know how common a term that actually is. Most notably books like 50 Shades of Grey or The Love Hypothesis. But in the past year, there has been a very noticeable shift. In the past, it was always a dirty secret that these books had started as fan fictions. Authors avoided talking about it like the plague, avoided questions about it. In the past year, that is the thing that's really shifted, where the authors and the publishers and the people writing puff pieces about them seem to be being a lot more loud and proud about the fact that these books used to be fan fictions. And the weirdest part? They're all Dramini fanfictions. Draco and Hermione, for those of you who don't know the lingo. Ethics of publishing a fanfiction have always sparked heated debate online, but especially with it being so much more out in the open now that these books are being pulled to publish, there has been so much discussion about the ethics of doing this. And I did not throw my hat in the ring when this was a big topic of conversation in the fall, because I feel like my thoughts were still marinating on it. I still had to figure out exactly how I felt. Now, with even more examples of this being announced, I finally am ready, after all this time, to discuss my feelings on this and explain to you guys what my stance is on published fanfiction and the ethics of it, and especially the ethics of marketing it as a published fanfiction. But I know I'm not the only one who procrastinates. Procrastination can get all of us, and that's where today's sponsor, ZocDoc, can help. We all know how it feels to procrastinate scheduling a doctor's appointment, spending months moving the task to tomorrow's to-do list, only to finally cave and just do it, and then you have to wait through a series of ridiculously long automated intros to press all these different numbers just to finally find a front desk person, only to find out they don't have an opening for another 6 months. You can skip that whole process for free with ZocDoc. They let you search and compare local in-network doctors with real reviews from patients and detailed doctor profiles to help you choose the right one. See actual appointment listings and click to instantly book your visit, usually within 24 to 72 hours, but sometimes even same-day appointments. And again, it's free to use. So click the link in the description to shake off that guilty procrastination feeling. Taking care of your health just got easier. Head to ZocDoc.com/Meredith Navaco to get started and check that appointment off your to-do list. In order to understand where we are now with published fanfiction, we must look at the history. We must consult the ancient texts. The most famous example of a published fanfiction is 50 Shades of Grey by E.L. James, which was originally a Twilight fanfiction before all the names were changed, and it was traditionally published as a separate novel, completely separated from Twilight. Ali Hazelwood is another very famous example. All of her early books were originally Reylo fanfictions that she had also changed all the names of to remove any connection to Star Wars. Some of you kids online might not be old enough to remember, but I am. I remember 50 Shades of Grey being published. I remember the craze behind it. I remember all the movies coming out. I was there for That's Not True, Ellen. I wasn't physically in the room, but I remember the whole media circus surrounding it. And I remember discovering myself after the first movie came out that it was originally a Twilight fanfiction. That was a dirty secret about 50 Shades of Grey. The publisher did not want you to know that. The author did not want you to know that. Eventually, it became a well-known enough thing that I would say it's more likely than not that people know it now. But I think I said this at one point in a different video, and I got a comment from somebody saying, wait, 50 Shades of Grey was a Twilight fanfiction? And in talking to people in my real life about the video I was working on, I had somebody say, wait, I didn't know that. For sure, it was not a part of the marketing. It was not something that anybody talked about. I'm not sure if it's something the author ever has addressed to this day, but certainly at the time was a secret and nobody knew. With Ali Hazelwood, it was more known just because fanfiction was a little bit more integrated into the general reading community at that point. And so even when The Love Hypothesis first came out, people were more aware of the fact that it was originally a fanfiction, but it was not marketed as such. fanfiction, so that was information you'd have had to have found somewhere else. And I still don't think it was that well known about it, especially with how popular the book is. There definitely are plenty of people who have read it who have no idea that it had its origins as a Reylo fanfiction. You might notice both of these examples have something really important in common, which was true of all published fanfiction, really, up until recently, which is that they were always AUs, which stands for alternate universe, meaning that these were fan fictions where the authors had taken the characters that they loved and put them into a completely different universe in a completely different situation, and then wrote a story about them. So for 50 Shades of Grey, it was Edward and Bella, but instead of being a vampire and a human girl, they were a CEO billionaire and a college English student. Same with the Love Hypothesis. It was Kylo Ren and Rey, but instead of being whoever they are in the Star Wars universe, because I'll admit I'm not that familiar, they were instead both professors at a college. She actually might have been finishing her PhD. It doesn't matter for the purposes of this video. 50 Shades of Grey did not take place in the Twilight universe, and vampires weren't a part of the story. The Love Hypothesis did not take place in the Star Wars universe, it just took place on Earth. And so with both of these books, it would have been fairly easy for the authors to file the serial numbers off, because pretty much all they had to do was go through and change all the names of the characters. And once you know, then especially with 50 Shades of Grey, you specifically can start to recognize who all the side characters are supposed to be, and you'll stumble across a random person and be like, oh, that must be Emmett. But if you didn't know, you would never know. And that's why I have been a staunch defender of things like 50 Shades of Grey and the Love Hypothesis. Because in my opinion, if you could change the first name of each of the characters and otherwise there is zero connection to the source material, and nobody reading it would ever connect it to the source material on their own, then you wrote an original story. Dare I say it, with original characters. I'm a huge fan of fan fiction as a writing exercise specifically. I personally have never been a big writer of it, but I think that if you are really overwhelmed at the idea of coming up with a bunch of characters in a fantasy world and all of that, then borrowing that stuff from media you really love just to get some practice in of writing plot and writing dialogue and writing scenes between characters, it can just be a really great writing exercise that has very little pressure, especially because when you're writing it, you have in your head that you can't ever publish it because it's inspired by another IP, and so you'd be committing copyright infringement, right? I think what can sometimes happen, especially with AUs, is that these end up becoming entirely original stories, really with original characters, but it freed the author up to actually write the story, to think of it as Edward and Bella, or to think of it as Kylo Ren and Rey, because then they didn't have to come up with their own characters and they already had an emotional attachment to these ones. But having read both 50 Shades of Grey and Twilight, and being a huge Twilight fan, I can tell you that Christian Grey and Anastasia don't feel like Edward and Bella to me at all. They feel like completely separate characters. My opinion is, if all you have to do is change the names and then it's otherwise unrecognizable, then you did write your own original story, and I don't think there's anything wrong with publishing it at that point. But in the past year, there have been a few high-profile examples of Draco and Hermione fan fiction getting traditional publishing deals. And the most famous ones were Rose in Chains and Alchemized. Now, both of these were not originally AUs, meaning that they did take place in the Harry Potter universe. And so a lot of the story had to be changed to get it ready for traditional publishing. But despite the fact that they then would have been significantly different in the published version than the other examples we've talked about would have been, because those really just changed the names, a large part of the marketing push has been selling these as Dramini fanfictions. I'm gonna get ahead of some comments I've been seeing online throughout this discussion over the last 6 months that I just think are asinine. Yes, it's technically not a part of the marketing materials, meaning it doesn't say on the book or on the back of the book that it's a Dramini fanfiction. However, every single article that you will find talking about the announcement of these books, where they got an interview with one of the authors, is entirely based around it being a Dramini fanfiction, and all of the questions that they ask the authors are about that. These sorts of articles are usually quid pro quo deals between the publications and the publishers. So the Guardian gets an interview with the author and the publisher gets some PR, which means they usually discuss what they want the questions to be and what they want the conversation to be centered around. Now, we don't know for sure if the publisher was really the one pushing the fanfiction angle, but I can tell you that every single article that you will find about Rose in Chains or Alchemized is based around them being Dramini fanfictions, and the whole interview is based around that, which heavily implies to me that that was coming from the publisher, not these publications. They have made it an integral part of the marketing that these were Harry Potter fanfictions originally. The fact that they are specifically Harry Potter fanfictions just introduces us to the most interesting moral conundrum, because most of the argument against published fanfiction is that if the original work was so heavily inspired by somebody else's IP, then can you ever really devoid it from the IP it was inspired by, and therefore is it always copyright infringement? But if the person whose copyright you're infringing on is she who will not be named, and she's not exactly held in the highest regard in public opinion right now for very good reason, then now what? And we will unpack that part of it a little bit more later, but there's a little bit more context I want to give before we get to that part, so just bear with me for a minute. This has opened up a whole host of questions, both about the legality and the ethics of all of this. And so I want to talk about the legality part first. Now, I am not a lawyer, so I did my best to wrap my brain around copyright law for all of us. But if you are a lawyer, please comment your thoughts, because I want to hear what you have to say about this. And luckily for us, the conversation about the legality of fan fiction is not a new question. People have been discussing this and litigating it for a really long time. Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976 is the piece of law that applies here. So this is what we need to look at. And basically, if one of these cases were to go to court and we were trying to figure out if fan fiction violated somebody's copyright, there would be 4 questions we need to look at. One is the purpose and character of the use, including whether such use is of a commercial nature or is for nonprofit educational purposes. And I will cut in here to say that the broad opinion about fanfiction for a long time has been that as long as you're not making money off of it, you're probably fine no matter what. So there aren't really monetization structures on fanfiction sites. All of it's free to read, free to exchange. And for the most part, I think we can all agree, as long as you're not making money off of it, it's completely fine, whatever, right? Number 2 is the nature of the copyrighted work. So this is from the Stanford website. Because the dissemination of facts or information benefits the public, you have more leeway to copy from factual works such as biographies than you do from fictional works such as plays or novels. In addition, you will have a stronger case of fair use if you copy the material from a published work than an unpublished work. The scope of fair use is narrower for unpublished works because an author has the right to control the first public appearance of his or her expression. That makes sense, right? So a lot of times fan fiction is based off of fiction. And so the nature of the copyrighted work is that it is fiction. 3, the amount and substantiality of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. This I also consulted the Stanford website to understand. The amount is just how much of it did you take. Substantiality gets to more of the heart of the original, right? So the example they give on the Stanford website is, for example, it would probably not be fair use to copy the opening guitar riff and the words "I can't get no satisfaction" from the song Satisfaction, right? Like, that is the core of that song. So if you copied that specifically, even if that was all you took, that would still count. And that final thing they look at is the effect of the use on the potential market for the copyrighted work. So would people potentially turn to this instead of the copyrighted work? And the example they give here is, in one case, an artist used a copyrighted photograph without permission as the basis for wood sculptures, copying all elements of the photo. The artist earned several $100,000 selling the sculptures. When the photographer sued, the artist claimed his sculptures were fair use because the photographer would never have considered making sculptures. The court disagreed, stating that it did not matter whether the photographer had considered making sculptures. What mattered was that a potential market for sculptures of the photograph existed. That photographer potentially could have made their own sculptures or sold the licensing for somebody else to do it, and they missed out on that money because this person stole it. So they violated copyright. Now, the biggest exception to copyright that basically gets you past all of these rules is parody. So if the purpose of you taking the copyright is to ridicule it, then you have a ton of leeway surrounding these rules. But because it gives you so much leeway, they are strict on it actually being parody for you to get those exceptions. So another example that I found is a case about Catcher in the Rye, where there was somebody who tried to put out a book that was Holden Caulfield at like 72 years old, and they tried to claim that it should be fine because it was parody. But the court found, to the extent defendants contend that 60 years in the character of Mr. C direct parodic comment or criticism at Catcher or Holden Caulfield, as opposed to Salinger himself, the court finds such contentions to be post hoc rationalizations employed through vague generalizations about the alleged naivete of the original rather than reasonably perceivable parody. That was a really wordy sentence. But basically they're saying here that they don't agree that it was parody. They think that was a post hoc rationalization. The purpose of it didn't really seem to be making any specific point about Catcher in the Rye or about the character of Holden Caulfield or J.D. Salinger, that they just used the character and then tried to say it was parody to explain it away when they got sued for copyright infringement. You can't just say it's parody, it has to actually be parody. But I wanted to read that one specifically because I love the post hoc rationalizations line. I do feel a little bit like we're running into some post hoc rationalizations with some of these published fan fictions now, specifically as it pertains to its tie to the original IP that is somewhat controversial due to the controversial author. Another thing that's been litigated in court with copyright law, specifically with publishing books, is the idea of a reference guide that pairs with another book. This one's also interesting because it was a Harry Potter reference guide and a lawsuit that involved J.K. Rowling, so I just thought it would be interesting to talk about. Essentially, the court found that the concept of a reference guide does not in and of itself violate IP or copyright because the reference guide would never replace the original. So if you had essentially an encyclopedia of Harry Potter terms, you would never read that and replace the experience of reading the Harry Potter books, right? It's supplemental, and so it is considered a different thing. And so even if the basis for that reference guide is somebody else's copyright, technically it's not copyright infringement. However, it was found that that specific book was copyright infringement because they had taken so much of the text from Harry Potter as their examples and explanations for what certain words meant or were in the series. And so it was found that too much of J.K. Rowling's words were used in the book for that specific book to get published. But the judge was really clear to say the precedent should be that a reference guide does not violate IP, but this specific reference guide does for like a different reason. So I just thought that was really interesting. But that's not to say that everybody agrees that fan fiction should be subject to any of these rules. In fact, there's a group called the Organization for Transformative Works, which was founded in 2007, and they hold the stance that all fan works should be considered fair use because they bring new meaning to the original work. You might not have heard of this organization themselves, but you probably have heard of their website, Archive of Our Own, or AO3. Now, technically, they're not saying that they think fan fiction should be exempt from the law, but instead they're making the argument that fan fiction doesn't violate the copyright law. And this brings me back to a point I made earlier in the video, which is that the dominant opinion in the reading space is that if you're not selling it, you're not committing copyright infringement. You're not making any money off of it, so you're not taking any profits from the author. I think the argument here outside of the nonprofit thing is that you're either reading, for example, Twilight fanfiction because you are a huge Twilight fan already, or you might discover Twilight and end up reading it through reading Twilight fanfiction. So those are the ways that the author kind of benefits, and that it doesn't deprive them of a source of income because it's not replacing the original work. So you're still going to go read the original work if that's what you want. That being said, as I've already mentioned, over the years, there have been many, and I mean many, authors very against the concept of fan fiction, and a lot of them have spoken very openly about it. But more recently, there have been a lot of authors that are a lot more complimentary of it and are completely fine with it. And so I thought we'd just go through some famous examples of quotes of what different authors have said about fan fiction over the years, just to kind of get an idea of how the authors feel about it. If you know anything about the history of this, then you probably assumed that at some point I was going to bring up Anne Rice. Anne Rice is the author of the Interview with a Vampire series, and she is very famous for being very against fan fiction of her books. However, she has since changed her stance a little bit. A recent quote said, "I got upset about 20 years ago because I thought it would block me." She said, "However, it's been very easy to avoid reading any, so live and let live. If I were a young writer, I'd want to own my own ideas, but maybe fan fiction is a transitional phase. Whatever gets you there, gets you there." So that's kind of what I was saying earlier about why I think fan fiction is a good writing exercise, because it gives you the opportunity to try some things out without having to come up with everything yourself. But I also view it as more of a transitionary period. And I'm not necessarily against, like I said, big examples like 50 Shades of Grey or The Love Hypothesis, but I do think it would be weird if E.L. James went on to continue writing Twilight fanfiction and then pulling it and changing the names and publishing it. Like, if she kept doing it after that, it would have been completely different. Sharon Lee and Steve Miller, who created the Leoden universe, sorry if that's not correct, strongly oppose fanfiction because, quote, I don't want other people interpreting our characters. Interpreting our characters is what Steve and I do. It's our job. Nobody else is going to get it right. This may sound rude and elitist, but honestly, it's not easy for us to get it right sometimes, and we've been living with these characters for a very long time. We built our universes and our characters. They are our intellectual property, and they are not toys lying about some virtual sandbox for other kids to pick up and modify at their whim. Steve and I do not sanction fanfic written in our universes. Any such work that exists without our permission and certainly without our support. That a crazy Diana Gabaldon quote. You're not ready for this. She's the author of Outlander. Quote, a good bit of my objection to fanfic, aside from the copyright issues, and I'm not sure how these apply when you take characters from one medium and implement them in another, particularly when one medium is TV, in which episodes may be written by a lot of different people, is that 99% of it is just awful, and it's revolting to see your characters being made to do and say idiotic things, or be forced to enact simple-minded sex fantasies, which is what most fanfic that comes to my unwilling attention is. Like someone selling your children into white slavery. You had me until the last line, Diana. Like, what? David Weber put it a lot more simply. He said, a writer cannot allow the free use of his universe without risking the loss of his own rights to it. These quotes I included specifically because they represent the two reasons why authors tend to be against fan fiction. I don't know how much this is still true, especially with how popular fan fiction is now, but a lot of these authors, at least back in the day, seem to have been advised by lawyers that if they did not defend their copyright, that they could lose the ability to defend it at all if a different copyright infringement case came around. And so from all the quotes I found, if an author was against it in principle, it was because of the point that Sharon Lee and Steve Miller made, especially if it's a series they're still actively writing. It's like, well, I'm still writing these characters. I'm still interpreting them. I don't think anybody else should have the right to write them and interpret them and alter them in the fan understanding as a result. And then there also are authors who maybe aren't against it on principle, but have been advised to be against it by legal counsel, because if they're not against it in this instance, they might lose the right to sue for copyright in a different situation where they want to. But that doesn't mean that all authors are against fan fiction. There's a very sweet Catherine Applegate quote where she said, "You are my collaborators in imagination. If I leave blanks, it's because I know you'll fill them." Sarah Rees Brennan with the Demon's Lexicon series said, "I think fan fiction is very cool. It's a way to have fun, be imaginative, and practice your writing, and if you want to write some based on my books, I'll be very flattered and pleased. You have my permission to go right ahead. I can't read it because that can get writers into nasty legal situations, and you're not allowed to make money off it. Otherwise, go right ahead." Stephen Brust said, "I, Stephen Brust, tell stories and publish my works because I want to spur the imaginations of my readers. I view non-commercial fan works as a natural extension of that inspiration. The only thing I can't support is anything that would damage my livelihood or reputation. Hence, keep the stuff non-commercial and label it as non-commercial fan fiction when disseminating/posting it." Absolutely incredible Meg Cabot quote. She wrote The Princess Diaries. Ugh, I love this quote so much. "I'm not going to get all authorish and beg you to please stop writing fan fiction based on my books because as a kid, I wrote reams and reams of fan fiction based on Star Wars, most of which I sent to George Lucas, who never thanked me, although I see he didn't use any of it in the next 3 films. He probably should have. I won't even prosecute you unless you try to make money using my characters without my permission. That is just evil and wrong." V.E. Schwab said, "I'm happy for people to write fan fiction, but I wouldn't want to see it on shelves." Similar to the quotes I included for the authors that were against it, there is a thread of similarity between all of these quotes as well. All of the authors that I found for it are super for it in non-commercial situations. I have yet to find somebody being like, yeah, you can just write my characters and sell the books if you want. So let's go back and look at our list for copyright infringement, and let's use an example like 50 Shades of Grey, and let's see if there would be a case for copyright infringement here. So the first question is the purpose and character of the use, including whether such use is of a commercial nature or is for nonprofit educational purposes. 50 Shades of Grey was traditionally published in a commercial fashion. It was published to make money off of it, right? So that checks that box. The nature of the copyrighted work. The original books that were copyrighted were the Twilight books. they are fiction for entertainment purposes. 50 Shades of Grey is also fiction for entertainment purposes. So Stephenie Meyer has a lot more protections over her work than if she were writing a nonfiction, right? So it checks that box as well. Now, number 3 is where I think 50 Shades of Grey frees itself from the copyright, which is the amount and substantiality of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. As I've already mentioned, I have read both of these books, and I can tell you that if you did not know that 50 Shades of Grey was a Twilight fan fiction, you would never know off of reading it alone. There is really no connection between the two works at all now, in isolation. In my opinion, the amount and substantiality used was very minimal. And finally, the effect of the use upon the potential market for or value of the copyrighted work. You would never read 50 Shades of Grey to not read Twilight. Even if they were both fiction for entertainment purposes, you would never say to yourself, well, I want to read Twilight, but I'll just read 50 Shades of Grey and that'll basically be the same thing. Like, you would never do that. And so I think it's those back two that make it so that 50 Shades of Grey isn't copyright infringement, more so than the front two, right? Now, if we go through the same exercise with, for example, Alchemized, the interesting thing for me in this is that the original Manacled, which was the name of the fan fiction, if published just in its own form, would have used a ton of stuff from the Harry Potter universe and 100% would have been found to be copyright infringement. But Sen-Lin Yu, the author, did go through and file the serial numbers off the same that authors of the past have done. But when they did it, they had to change a lot in the story to do that. They had to completely create their own world and make the story work for that world. Sen gave some really interesting quotes to The Guardian about the process of doing it. So this is from The Guardian. Stripping away the Harry Potter and overt Handmaid's Tale references was not in any way pleasant or something they would ever want to do again. I would rather be shot, Sen told their Tumblr followers last year. They described the process as taking two 5,000-piece jigsaw puzzles and having to use both to build a new puzzle that somehow makes sense. Do not recommend. I also had to scrap and build from scratch an entirely new healing and medicine system, and it was literally traumatic. I'm gonna give them the benefit of the doubt with the second half of this quote, because if you were writing a fantasy from scratch, you would also have to create a new healing and medicine system from scratch. But I think they just meant taking out one that was already there and putting in a new one that made sense but was different. I just really like this analogy of they describe the process as taking two 5,000-piece jigsaw puzzles and having to use both to build a new puzzle that somehow made sense. In a way, this quote, and you guys might be saying I'm interpreting in bad faith, so please feel free to tell me if this isn't how you interpret this, but it seems like they're saying that the two 5,000-piece jigsaw puzzles here, because Manacled was a joint like Handmaid's Tale and Harry Potter fanfiction, but it's way more Harry Potter than it was Handmaid's Tale, and that these were the two 5,000-piece jigsaw puzzles they were talking about, and that they had to split that up and turn it into a new puzzle that made a new picture that still made sense. So according to their own words, there is still this foundation in the worlds that are the Harry Potter world and the Handmaid's Tale world. They just had to split it up and make a new picture. One could argue that that is just what inspiration is, and so as long as the final work itself is completely devoid of any references to the original in the same way of the example I gave of 50 Shades and Twilight, in theory, I think it would mostly check the same boxes. Except that I hinted at the beginning of the video that, of course, J.K. Rowling is an incredibly controversial author right now for good reason. She's a TERF. Safe to say, we do not stand with TERFs on this channel. Trans rights are human rights. There is this added layer of an ethics question with these Dramini fanfictions specifically surrounding the ethics of supporting and potentially pulling in fans who might support J.K. Rowling, and then she then gives that money to initiatives that hurt trans people. So there is this added layer of the ethics here of pulling people into the Dramini fanfiction might pull them into the Harry Potter fandom, and then they might go on to support J.K. Rowling. And what a lot of these authors have said in response to this point is that publishing these fanfictions is a form of reclaiming this story, and that in their opinion they can do it without supporting J.K. Rowling's opinions, and that engaging with Dramini fanfiction at all is a way of still engaging with the Harry Potter world and the Harry Potter fandom without supporting J.K. Rowling. So it's a way of reclaiming it away from somebody they don't support. Now, the point still stands that pulling people into the Dramini fanfiction might pull them into the Harry Potter fanfiction, and they might not have the same barriers you have to ensure they're not supporting J.K. Rowling. But also, the fascinating thing to me about that point is that it in theory, potentially puts them at risk of being found liable for copyright infringement. No, because if one of our 4 rules was about the effect of the use on the original copyrighted work, if you're coming out and saying that potentially part of the purpose of doing this is that you can read this fan fiction and now these published works instead of reading Harry Potter and supporting J.K. Rowling, then doesn't that violate that? Now, that's what I'm saying. I'm no lawyer, and obviously I don't support J.K. Rowling at all, but I'm just wondering if saying that so openly kind of takes away some of your legal protections surrounding the copyright infringement. I don't know. I mean, JKR is notoriously very litigious over her IP, and so I think if she had a case, we probably would have seen a case already, so I'm assuming she doesn't have a case. There is also speculation out there that she potentially was in on it, or there was some kind of conversation had behind the scenes about it, because there suspiciously were multiple Dramini fan fictions published all around the same time, and so a lot of people were confused as to how all that could have happened at once. I do not really subscribe to this theory, because I think if something like that were happening, we would know by now by a more definitive source. I think secrets like that don't usually stay secret for very long. But anyway, all of that to say that even if they're legally in the clear, legal and ethical don't always align. So is publishing fanfiction with the serial numbers filed off and marketing it as a published fanfiction unethical, even if it isn't illegal? In order to talk about this, we have to talk about why publishers do this. If there even is any kind of copyright question, why not just err on the side of not doing it to be safe? Well, with published fanfiction in general, if you have a fanfiction online that already has been really successful with readers when they had free access to it, then you have a little bit more of a guarantee that when you traditionally publish it, it's going to land well with readers as well. If thousands of people have read it online and really liked it, then presumably thousands of people could read the published version and also really like it. So you can kind of screen that the writing lands with readers and that people enjoy it. But if that's the benefit of pulling to publish in general, then why the shift to starting to market it as a published fanfiction? Well, the only reason to do that would be to market it to people who were fans of the original fan fiction so that they can read this one and have a bound copy. But also, you might pull in a bunch of new readers with this. Well, if you like this other thing, then you might like this because it's super similar. There are potentially people who want to read this book because they're really into the dynamic between Draco and Hermione. And so if this was so heavily inspired by that, then it's kind of like a, oh, if you'd like this, you'd like this as well sort of thing. So for marketing, they're doing it for marketing, right? So the downside of doing that is that it's then tied to the original, because you tied it to the original in the marketing. And this is where I just bang my head against the wall in these conversations. And it was part of why I didn't make a video on it when it was the conversation, just because I honestly feel like this is common sense. If you don't want it tied to the original IP, then you can't tie it to the IP in your marketing. You can't do all these puff pieces that are entirely centered around it being a published fan fiction if you don't want people to talk about its connections to the IP it was originally based off of. This is literally the exact same thing of the book to movie adaptations we've been talking about on this channel, where they will title the movie the name of the book that they are basing the movie off of, and then not base the movie off of that book at all. And then people act like just because the writer or director said in an interview at some point that they weren't trying to do the most faithful adaptation, that we all just need to not expect it to be similar to the original and let that go. No. You titled this movie Frankenstein. You titled this movie Wuthering Heights. So that was to pull people into the theater because they recognize those names and want to see that IP on screen. So then if people come to the theater and don't see the IP on screen, they're allowed to be disappointed. And I made the point when I was talking about this with Wuthering Heights that it's not even really about ethics at this point. It's just about whether or not you're going to be successful making this argument. Like, Wuthering Heights did not land with audiences because it didn't feel like Wuthering Heights, and it was sold to them as Wuthering Heights. You don't get control over how people interpret your art. And I just feel like this is literally the exact same thing. This is these authors and publishers wanting to be able to benefit off of marketing these things as published fan fiction with the serial numbers filed off, but then want to have their cake and eat it too, and want everybody to just be like, yeah, but it's completely separate from the original, so there's no ethical questions here, and there's no connection to J.K. Rowling, and there's no connection to Harry Potter, and so we just need to not talk about it and not worry about it. No. If there's no connection to Harry Potter, then don't connect it to Harry Potter. It's common sense, I fear. I don't understand the logic. I don't understand it. You don't get to have your cake and eat it too. You get to benefit off of marketing it as a Harry Potter fan fiction, or you get to say that it's completely separate from Harry Potter, and so we shouldn't even be having a conversation about whether or not this is ethical and if the two are connected together. But if you are connecting the two together in the interviews and in the puff pieces in order to benefit off of the marketing, then the things are tied together now, and everybody knows that, and so people are gonna have conversations about it, and they're gonna have opinions about it, and you don't get to tell them they don't. Again, it's not even about ethics, it's just about whether or not you're gonna be successful. You're just never going to be successful doing that. It is tied to Harry Potter because you tied it to Harry Potter. So then if people don't want to read it because they don't want to support anything Harry Potter related, then they're within that right. Actually, only The Guardian and Rolling Stone get to do that because we agreed to puff piece interviews with them, but that's only for the people who would be interested in a Draco and Hermione romance. And any of you who wouldn't read this book because you don't want to support anything Harry Potter related, you don't get to tie it to Harry Potter. We only get the positive association with it, and we actually want none of the negative. Thanks, everyone. You're just not going to be successful doing that. And that's why I honestly think this whole conversation is like pointless. We've been running in circles about nothing for months. Cause and effect exists. Cause, you connected it to Harry Potter. Effect, other people view it as tied to Harry Potter. End of conversation, I fear. If somebody doesn't want to support anything related to Harry Potter because they don't want to support J.K. Rowling at all, then that is their prerogative. And you don't get to tell them that they don't get to do that just because it's not technically putting money in J.K. Rowling's pocket. And the final thing I want to talk about in this video before we wrap up is this unoriginal? Maybe legally they're in the clear. Ethically, it's a gray area at best. But is it original? And I specifically want to talk about this because there was a quote in the Guardian article that Sen gave that it's my favorite type of defense that people give something online. I absolutely adore it when people say, well, people aren't saying that about this other thing. And either it 100% is something that people are saying about that other thing, or there's surface level similarities between these two things, but there's a fundamental difference that makes things completely different. And this quote checks both of those boxes. So this is again from the Guardian article. People tend to take the most scandalous, the most salacious thing about it and then run with that, or they will see it as really derisible, accusing fanfiction writers of not having original ideas, says Sen. The author notes that Greek retellings, books such as Circe, The Silence of the Girls, and The Song of Achilles, which have become so popular in recent years, aren't criticized for being unoriginal, despite relying on the same principle as fanfiction. The inconsistency is funny to me. So they are essentially saying they don't understand why people say fanfiction is unoriginal because nobody says that about Greek retellings. Yes, they do. What are you talking about? This is absolutely a topic of conversation about Greek retellings. I don't know where you have been in online book discourse, but that's 100% something people say about Greek retellings. But it also is like a surface level connection between these two things, but they have a fundamental difference that makes things completely different. Greek mythology is thousands of years old and never had an original copyright holder to begin with. It was communal lore. So a Greek retelling is much more similar to me as something like an Omegaverse book or a Fae lore book. It's maybe a little bit more in-depth of lore where there are stories and characters involved in it, but Omegaverse is a communal lore. Fae is a communal lore. You can write a book using these lore structures and you're not infringing on any one person's copyright because these lore structures were kind of created by a community, and so no specific person owns the rights to it. So Greek retellings were like that, right? They were communal lore and communal stories that we don't have an origin for. They were stories that were passed down through generations and eventually were written down and just stamped under the name Homer, but Homer isn't a person. And again, thousands of years old. So even if there was an original copyright holder, safe to say it's expired. So again, that absolutely is something that people say about Greek retellings. And Harry Potter is a specific IP owned by a specific person that's still alive. So pretty big fundamental difference between these things that I think does make the conversation different. So I'm going to give you guys my stance on this, and this is pure opinion. People are inspired by things, right? And I don't think there's anything wrong with seeing something and saying, I like this aspect of the dynamic between those two characters. I want to rope something similar to that into my book. And we're kind of in a zone where whether or not an author gets flack for this is tied to whether or not they published the fan fiction before it got traditionally published, or how open an author is about modeling the dynamic about specific other people. The internet tends to really want things to be super black and white, and we want to be able to say published fan fiction is okay or it isn't. Filing the serial numbers off is okay or it isn't. It's original or it is not. And I just don't think these conversations are ever going to be that black and white. I think it depends on each individual work. I've already shared in this video that I think that both 50 Shades of Grey and The Love Hypothesis are plenty more than original enough that I don't think there was anything wrong with filing the serial numbers off and publishing them for money. Those are the examples of this was clearly inspiration, not copying. But I'll also call back to a video that I made about Powerless versus the Red Queen, where it's my opinion that Powerless did copy the Red Queen way too much, but it wasn't fan fiction, at least that we know of. I don't think it has to be fan fiction to be unoriginal, obviously, and I don't necessarily think that just because it was fan fiction means that it wasn't original enough to be published on its own, but I think it has to be a case-by-case basis. So I'm not going to comment on whether or not I think either Rose in Chains or Alchemized are transformative enough, because I have not read either of those books. I think it'll have to be a case-by-case basis, so I think you'd have to read the books and compare them to the original. But to me, that's not really what this conversation is about, or at least that's not what my video is about. My video is not about whether or not these books were original enough to get published. My video here is mostly just about how ridiculous I think it is that these authors and these publishers want to have their cake and eat it too. And there's been more published fan fiction announced, and it's re-sparked this conversation, and I just, I don't know how else to say it other than you can't have your cake and eat it too. If you market it as a fan fiction, people will tie it to the original IP, and it will spark a conversation about whether or not that was an ethical thing to do. And then it is intrinsically tied to the original work. So then if people don't want to support that original work, they might not support yours either because you tied it to that work. I want all the upsides and none of the downsides. It just doesn't really work like that, you know? So anyway, that's gonna be all for me today, you guys. Let me know what you think about this. I was asked to make this video by a few different of you guys, and so that's part of what inspired me to make it now, even though it's kind of not a super relevant topic of conversation anymore. So I am very curious to hear what you guys think. Let me know in the comments down below. I love you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!